Imagine a railway stretching across the heart of Canada, connecting some of the country's biggest cities, moving people and goods faster, and giving Ottawa something it has not always had in its relationship with Washington, another option. For decades, Canada and the United States have been tied together by one of the world's largest trading relationships. Factories on one side of the border depend on components from the other. Farmers depend on American customers. Manufacturers depend on Canadian resources. Railways, highways, pipelines, ports, and power grids connect the two economies so closely that a disruption in one country can quickly become a problem in the other. But that relationship has entered a new and more uncertain era. Tariffs have changed the conversation. And as Washington has increasingly used tariffs and trade restrictions as instruments of economic policy, Canada has been forced to reconsider a question that goes far beyond any single tariff rate. How much control does Canada really have over its own economic future if so much of its trade depends on access to the United States? That question helps explain why rail infrastructure has become more than a transportation issue. It is becoming part of Canada's broader economic strategy. The headlines surrounding Canada's railway ambitions may sound simple, a multi-billion-dollar railway reaching completion while Washington focuses on tariffs. But the reality is more complicated. Canada is not suddenly abandoning the United States. The two economies remain deeply integrated, and no railway can replace the scale of the American market overnight. What Canada is doing, however, is beginning to think differently about economic dependence. Instead of asking only how to sell more products to the United States, policymakers are increasingly asking how Canada can build more infrastructure, strengthen domestic supply chains, connect its regions more effectively, and create alternative routes to global markets. That shift matters because tariffs work by increasing the cost of cross-border trade. If a Canadian company sells a product into the American market and a tariff is imposed, the economics of that transaction can change almost immediately. Margins become smaller, prices can rise, customers can look for alternatives, companies may delay investment, and businesses that have spent decades designing supply chains around an open North American market suddenly have to consider whether those supply chains remain reliable. This is where infrastructure enters the picture. Infrastructure cannot eliminate tariffs. A new railway does not make a tariff disappear. But infrastructure can change the choices available to a country, and choices are important when trade relations become uncertain. Canada already has a massive rail system supporting the movement of commodities and manufactured goods. Canadian railways generated about 21.7 billion Canadian dollars in operating revenue in 2024, according to the Railway Association of Canada, while total operating expenses were about $14.8 billion. That $14.8 billion number is important for another reason. It illustrates how easily large figures connected to Canada's railway sector can be misunderstood. The $14.8 billion figure is not evidence that Canada has just completed a $14.8 billion railway. It refers to the industry's operating expenses in 2024. That distinction matters because in an era of viral headlines, enormous numbers can quickly become detached from their original meaning. And when those numbers are placed next to words like tariffs, Washington, competition, and economic independence, the resulting story can become much more dramatic than the underlying facts. The real story is still significant. Canada is trying to strengthen its economic position at a moment when its relationship with the United States is under unusual pressure. And rail is one of the tools available to do that. Consider the geography. Canada is enormous. Its population and economic activity are concentrated in relatively narrow corridors, while huge distances separate major cities and industrial regions. For much of Canadian history, transportation infrastructure has been designed around practical economic needs, moving resources outward, bringing manufactured goods inward, and connecting population centers. That model worked remarkably well, but it also created vulnerabilities. If the most important customer for a Canadian industry is in the United States, and the most efficient route to that customer crosses the border, then any political decision affecting the border can have economic consequences. The United States understands this. Canada understands it too. That is why tariffs are not merely a technical issue involving customs schedules. They are a question of leverage. Washington can use access to the American consumer market as a bargaining tool because that market is extraordinarily important to Canadian businesses. Canada, meanwhile, has its own forms of leverage. It supplies the United States with critical resources, energy, agricultural products, industrial materials, and components. The two countries are not simply buyer and seller, they are deeply connected partners. That mutual dependence is precisely what makes a trade confrontation so complicated. A tariff can hurt the country imposing it as well as the country receiving it. A manufacturer may pay a tariff on a Canadian input. That manufacturer may then pass the cost to American customers. An American company may discover that a Canadian supplier cannot absorb the additional expense. The supplier may lose business. The American company may then have to pay more to find another source. In other words, tariffs can travel through supply chains, and railways are at the center of many of those supply chains. Steel moves by rail, grain moves by rail, coal and minerals move by rail, forest products move by rail, containers and manufactured goods can move by rail. Rail is not simply about passengers. It is part of the physical infrastructure that makes trade possible. That is why Canada's efforts to improve transportation infrastructure have taken on a broader strategic meaning. One example is the Alto High-Speed Rail Initiative. The Canadian government describes Alto as a primarily dedicated and electrified rail network intended to connect Toronto, Peterborough, Ottawa, Montreal, Laval, Trois-Rivières, and Quebec City, with trains capable of reaching speeds of up to 300 kilometers per hour. The project is ambitious. But it is important to understand what it is not. It is not a completed $14.8 billion railway. It is a developing infrastructure initiative. That distinction does not make it irrelevant to the tariff debate. In fact, it may make the debate more interesting, because Canada's infrastructure strategy is increasingly connected to a larger discussion about resilience. Resilience means having the ability to absorb a shock without allowing that shock to cripple the entire system. For a country deeply dependent on one trading partner, resilience can mean creating more options, more domestic transportation capacity, more ports, more efficient rail corridors, more internal trade, more access to markets outside North America, and faster movement between Canada's own major economic centers. This does not necessarily mean turning away from the United States. It can mean becoming less vulnerable to sudden changes in American policy. That is a very different objective. Canada and the United States will remain neighbors, they will remain major trading partners, their economies will remain interconnected. The question is whether Canada wants that relationship to be based on necessity alone, or whether it wants to enter future negotiations with a broader set of alternatives. This is where the phrase "outmaneuvers Washington" needs to be treated carefully. It would be easy to describe every Canadian infrastructure project as a strategic victory over the United States. But that would oversimplify the situation. Infrastructure takes years. Trade diversification takes years. Building rail lines, ports, energy terminals, and industrial capacity requires enormous capital. Companies also need time to change suppliers and establish new markets. A government cannot announce a railway today and expect tariff exposure to disappear tomorrow. The economic effects of infrastructure accumulate gradually. That is why the more accurate interpretation is not that Canada has suddenly defeated Washington. It is that Canada is attempting to increase its room to maneuver. And that may be one of the most important developments in North American economic policy. For years, the North American economy was built around efficiency. Companies sought the cheapest and fastest way to produce and distribute goods. Borders became less important. Factories specialized. Components crossed the border multiple times during the manufacturing process. A vehicle could contain parts produced in Canada, the United States, and Mexico before reaching the final customer. That system created enormous efficiencies. But efficiency and resilience are not always the same thing. A system designed for maximum efficiency can be vulnerable when the political environment changes. Tariffs expose that vulnerability. So do wars. So do pandemics. So do shipping disruptions. And so do sudden changes in government policy. The lesson policymakers are increasingly drawing is that transportation infrastructure must serve not only economic efficiency, but also strategic resilience. For Canada, that means looking inward as well as outward. Can goods move efficiently from one Canadian region to another? Can Canadian companies reach ports without depending entirely on American routes? Can producers access customers in Europe and Asia? Can internal trade barriers be reduced? Can infrastructure projects be approved and built more quickly? These questions have become more urgent as trade tensions with Washington have intensified. Canada's government has already promoted measures designed to speed major infrastructure and resource projects and reduce internal trade barriers. In 2025, Ottawa introduced legislation aimed at accelerating approvals for major projects while dismantling some barriers between Canadian provinces and territories. The initiative was explicitly presented against the backdrop of U.S. tariffs and economic uncertainty. That is a significant clue about Canada's broader strategy. The goal is not simply to retaliate against the United States. The goal is to make Canada itself work better as an economic system. That distinction is crucial. If provinces have unnecessary barriers between them, Canadian companies may find it easier to trade internationally than to trade domestically. If major infrastructure projects take years to approve before construction can even begin, capital may go elsewhere. If rail connections are inefficient, companies may depend more heavily on trucks. If ports lack capacity, access to global markets becomes less useful. So the tariff dispute may be producing an unexpected domestic effect. It may be forcing Canada to confront weaknesses that existed before the current trade tensions. This is where the railway story becomes much bigger than trains. A railway represents physical connectivity. But economic connectivity also depends on regulations, energy systems, ports, telecommunications, labor mobility, investment, and industrial policy. Building one component without improving the others can limit the benefit. Canada's challenge is therefore not simply to build, it is to build strategically, and the United States is watching. Washington has long benefited from the extraordinary economic integration of North America. American manufacturers have access to Canadian resources. American consumers have access to Canadian products. American companies operate across the border. The United States also benefits from Canada's role as a stable supplier of energy and raw materials. So if Canada begins strengthening alternative trade routes, the effects may eventually be felt in the United States as well. But again, the word eventually matters. Infrastructure is slow. Politics is fast. Tariffs can be announced in a matter of days. A railway can take years. That mismatch creates one of the central challenges for Canada. How do you respond to an immediate trade shock with infrastructure that produces benefits only over the long term? The answer cannot be infrastructure alone. In the short term, governments may need targeted support for affected industries, negotiations with Washington, temporary trade measures, and efforts to help businesses find alternative customers. In the long term, infrastructure can make those alternatives more practical. Think of it as building an economic safety net. The first layer is diplomacy. The second is domestic economic capacity. The third is transportation. The fourth is market diversification. The stronger each layer becomes, the less vulnerable the overall system is. That does not mean Canada should stop trading with America. Quite the opposite. A stronger Canada could potentially be a stronger trading partner for the United States. Canadian companies with more transportation options and more diversified markets may be better positioned to absorb disruptions. American companies with more diversified Canadian suppliers may also benefit. The long-term objective may therefore be not separation, but greater balance. This is especially important because Canada cannot simply replace the United States. The American economy is enormous. Its consumer market is one of the largest in the world. Geographic proximity makes trade between the two countries unusually efficient. Even if Canada expands trade with Europe, Asia, and other regions, the United States will remain central. The issue is dependence. There is a difference between choosing to trade with your largest neighbor and having no realistic alternative. That difference is the strategic space Canada is trying to create, and railways can help create it. A high-speed passenger rail network, for example, has a different purpose from freight rail. It does not directly replace the freight corridors carrying Canadian exports, but it can change the internal structure of the economy. Fast rail can connect labor markets. It can connect cities. It can reduce dependence on short-haul flights. It can encourage development around transportation corridors. It can make business travel between major Canadian centers easier. And over time, it can contribute to a more integrated domestic economy. The Alto Initiative illustrates that ambition. The Canadian government says the project will link major population centers along the Toronto to Quebec City corridor and use primarily dedicated electrified infrastructure. That is not a tariff weapon. It is something more fundamental. It is an attempt to improve Canada's internal connectivity. And that matters because economic independence is not created by slogans. It is created by capacity. Capacity to produce, capacity to transport, capacity to finance, capacity to innovate, capacity to sell, and capacity to withstand disruption. This is where the tariff debate becomes a test of economic strategy. If Washington imposes tariffs and Canada responds only with retaliation, the two countries can enter a cycle in which each new measure produces another countermeasure. Businesses become uncertain. Investment slows, consumers pay more, and political pressure increases. But if Canada uses the disruption as an incentive to improve its own infrastructure and reduce internal barriers, the long-term outcome could be different. Instead of simply responding to American policy, Canada could gradually reshape the conditions under which its economy operates. That would not be an overnight victory. It would be a slow strategic adjustment. And slow adjustments can be more consequential than dramatic announcements. There is another factor to consider. Canada has historically faced criticism for the time and cost involved in major infrastructure projects. Large projects can encounter regulatory delays, financing challenges, environmental reviews, community opposition, and changing political priorities. That means Canada's ability to turn infrastructure ambitions into completed projects is itself a strategic question. Announcing a railway is easy, financing it is harder, approving it is harder, building it is harder, operating it efficiently for decades is harder still. If Canada wants infrastructure to serve as a response to trade uncertainty, it has to demonstrate that it can move from announcements to execution. That is one reason the distinction between planned, funded, under construction, and completed projects matters so much. A headline can make a project sound finished long before the first passenger boards a train. Investors, businesses, and governments need something more concrete. They need schedules. They need financing. they need contracts, they need construction, and eventually, they need service. The same principle applies to trade diversification. It is easy to say Canada should sell more to Europe or Asia, but selling to distant markets requires competitive products, reliable shipping, ports, insurance, financing, regulatory access, and stable relationships. A customer in Asia does not become an alternative to an American customer simply because a government signs an agreement. The entire supply chain has to work. That is why transportation is so important. Trade policy and infrastructure policy are connected. A country can negotiate access to a market, but without infrastructure, it may not be able to use that access efficiently. Canada already has a substantial rail industry supporting international trade. The Railway Association of Canada reported that freight-related railway revenues rose in 2024, while railways also increased their investments. Those numbers suggest that rail remains a major component of Canada's economic system, but they also reveal the scale of the challenge. Canada does not need one railway. It needs a transportation network capable of supporting a modern economy under changing conditions. That means maintenance, it means capacity, it means technology, it means terminals, it means ports, and it means coordination between governments and private operators. The tariff dispute with Washington, therefore, becomes a kind of stress test. Can Canada's infrastructure handle uncertainty? Can its companies redirect exports? Can its ports absorb additional volume? Can its railways move more goods efficiently? Can its domestic market absorb production that might otherwise have gone south? These questions are not theoretical. They determine how much leverage a country has. There is a tendency in international politics to think of leverage as something governments possess through military power or diplomatic alliances. Economic infrastructure creates another kind of leverage. A country with multiple trade routes has more choices. A country with multiple customers has more choices. A country with strong domestic supply chains has more choices. A country with reliable infrastructure has more choices. And countries with more choices are generally less vulnerable to pressure. That is perhaps the deeper meaning behind Canada's infrastructure push. It is not about defeating America. It is about reducing the number of situations in which Canada has no alternative. The distinction may sound subtle, but economically, it is enormous. For decades, the Canadian-American relationship was often described as one of mutual dependence. That remains true, yet the balance of dependence is never completely fixed. It can change as infrastructure changes, it can change as energy markets change, it can change as technology changes, and it can change as governments change policy. Tariffs accelerate that process because they force companies to reconsider assumptions that once seemed permanent. A Canadian manufacturer that once relied almost entirely on American buyers may start looking elsewhere. A Canadian investor who once assumed the U.S. market would remain completely predictable may begin looking at domestic opportunities. A Canadian government that once treated infrastructure primarily as an economic development issue may begin viewing it as a national resilience issue. And that is where the story becomes larger than a single railway. The railway becomes a symbol of a broader question. What kind of economy does Canada want to have? One built primarily around access to one enormous neighboring market, or one that continues trading heavily with the United States while also developing stronger internal connections and more international alternatives? The second option is more difficult. It costs money, it requires patience, it requires political cooperation, and it may not produce dramatic results immediately, but it can create resilience. Washington's tariff strategy, meanwhile, carries its own risks. Tariffs can provide negotiating leverage, they can protect selected industries, they can encourage domestic production, but they can also increase costs and disrupt supply chains. When applied against a closely integrated partner such as Canada, those effects can be particularly complicated. A tariff does not operate in isolation. It moves through companies, it moves through transportation systems, it moves through consumers, and eventually it can move back into the economy of the country that imposed it. That is why Canada and the United States face a difficult balancing act. Neither side can completely ignore the other. The geography is too powerful, the supply chains are too integrated, the economic relationship is too large. But both sides are now learning that integration does not guarantee stability. Rules can change, tariffs can change, political priorities can change, and infrastructure can determine how quickly businesses adapt. For Canada, the response may therefore be less about finding one dramatic countermeasure and more about building a portfolio of options, more infrastructure, more domestic trade, more export markets, more investment, more industrial capacity, more reliable transportation, and stronger bargaining power. If that strategy succeeds, the effect may not look like a victory on a single day. There may be no moment when Canada can point to a railway and say, "This changed everything." Instead, the change may appear gradually. A company chooses a Canadian supplier instead of an American one. A producer sends goods through a Canadian port rather than an American route. A manufacturer expands in Canada because domestic transportation has improved. A traveler chooses rail between major cities instead of flying. A foreign investor sees Canada not simply as an extension of the American market, but as a market with its own infrastructure and strategic advantages. Those individual decisions can accumulate, and accumulated decisions can reshape an economy. That is why the current debate over Canadian rail infrastructure deserves attention. Not because one railway has suddenly transformed North America, and not because Canada has somehow eliminated its dependence on the United States. It has not. The more important story is that Canada appears increasingly aware that infrastructure is part of economic sovereignty. The ability to move people and goods is ultimately the ability to make economic choices, and economic choices become especially valuable when political relationships become uncertain. The United States still has enormous influence over Canada. Canada still has enormous influence over the United States. Neither country can easily walk away from the relationship. But the rules of that relationship are being tested. Tariffs have made that clear, and Canada's response could determine how the relationship evolves. Will the two countries return to a model based on deeper integration and relatively predictable trade? Will tariffs remain a recurring feature of North American economic policy? Will Canada successfully expand its trade beyond the American market? Will major infrastructure projects actually be completed on schedule and within reasonable budgets? And will Canada's provinces and federal government be able to cooperate closely enough to build the infrastructure required for the next generation? Those questions remain open. The railway story, therefore, is still being written. What we can say with confidence is that Canada is looking more seriously at infrastructure as a tool of resilience. The Alto Initiative is one example of that broader ambition. Although it remains a project under development rather than a completed $14.8 billion railway, and Canada's existing rail system already demonstrates the scale of the economic network at stake. In 2024, Canadian Railways generated $21.7 billion in operating revenue, while spending $14.8 billion on operations. Those figures show that rail is not a peripheral industry. It is embedded in the Canadian economy. So when trade policy changes, transportation policy matters. When tariffs rise, supply chains matter. When relations with Washington become uncertain, alternatives matter. And when Canada invests in infrastructure, the question is not simply how fast a train can travel. The question is how much economic freedom that infrastructure creates. That may ultimately be the most important lesson from the current Canada-US trade confrontation. A country cannot control every decision made by its largest trading partner. It cannot control foreign tariffs. It cannot control elections in another country. It cannot guarantee that international trade will always remain predictable. But it can influence its own capacity. It can build, it can connect. It can diversify, it can remove barriers inside its own borders, and it can create more ways to move goods, people, and capital. That does not guarantee victory, but it creates options. And in international economics, options are a form of power. The headline may suggest that Canada has already outmaneuvered Washington. The reality is more measured. Canada is not finished with its economic transformation. Its infrastructure ambitions are still being tested. Its trade relationship with the United States remains enormous. And the ultimate success of its strategy will depend on execution, investment, and political cooperation.